for investors, they're impatient. They want their money as soon as possible. And if you're not going to deliver sales soon, they'll find somebody who will, and they'll invest their money there. Compressing that timeline to actually making a sale is really critical for attracting investment dollars in a particular thing. In the case of DoD, they're very concerned with how that object that's being bought integrates with the rest of the weapon systems, how reliable it is, how safe it is, ruggedization. There's an enormous number of things that have to be looked at in different criteria to make something valuable from the point of view of somebody who's trying to buy this for mass usage in a variety of environments.
Welcome everyone to today's edition of The Future Of, where we'll be discussing private capital in the public sector. Our focus is on a topic that's gaining urgency and attention: how private capital, venture capital, private equity, and other forms of investment can play a pivotal role in strengthening the U.S. defense industrial base. The challenge we're tackling is twofold. On one hand, the Department of Defense faces budget constraints and increasingly competitive global landscape. On the other hand, there's a perception that private capital isn't fully leveraged and incentivized to support defense innovation and supply chain. We'll explore why that is, what's working, what's not, and what steps can be taken to bridge the gap between private investors and public investment. Our goal is to demystify the intersection of private capital and defense, highlight the opportunity and the obstacles, and offer actionable insights for both government and industry stakeholders. Today, I'm joined by Sam Moyer, a research fellow at the National Defense Industrial Association's Emerging Technology Institute. Sam is a leading voice in private capital trends in the defense sector and has a background in technology policy, supply chain analysis, innovative contracting, and venture capital. He is at the forefront of research into how private capital can be mobilized to strengthen our national security posture. With that, I'm going to let Sam take the mic and provide us with more of an introduction.
Thanks, AJ. Yeah, great to be here. And as you said, I'm a researcher at NDIA's Emerging Technology Institute. We conduct research on the future of defense technology and the topic that we're talking about today, private capital in the defense industrial base. This is something that our membership at NDIA has become very interested in. We're a large trade association of defense contractors, and more folks are interested in this topic of how to increase or enhance the use of private capital for defense technology. So we've been taking a look at that.
Great. So why don't we set the stage at the beginning? Why does private capital matter? Let's talk a little bit about the overarching challenges we have and we're seeing between public and private capital.
Yeah, private capital is really critical to the defense industrial base because ultimately every defense capability has to be created somewhere. And so that requires capital to flow in and enable production of factories, new technologies, research and development, training new employees. A lot of that comes from the Defense Department and other government agencies, but a lot of it is dual use in nature and comes from private companies, and those companies have to get the capital somewhere, and so they borrow it, they raise capital in terms of equity in other places. So the U.S. has the largest and most sophisticated by far capital markets in the world. So that's a great resource that American companies and our allies have to draw upon. So it's a really great resource, and the goal is just to enhance the way that it's being used and find new ways to use that resource.
Yeah, so we talk about U.S. having one of the largest investment opportunities. What are some of the gaps that we're seeing that your research has shown? And tell us a little bit more about the way that you've approached the research and some of the questions that you were trying to answer with that.
Yeah, so the gap is that folks are always looking for ways to find more money to enable Defense Department missions. So it's a natural thing to look for, in addition to raising the federal budget, to look at other sources of capital, and private capital is the next biggest source out there. The way we've been looking at this is we started by earlier this year taking a look at just how companies are using their capital and investing it, and then using that to enable them to pursue defense missions, right? Sell to the Defense Department. And so we've talked to folks in the private sector companies, investor-backed companies, and then the investment firms, as well as folks in the government who've started to engage, really have a long history of engaging investor-backed companies and private capital to look at the tactics that they use, because it turns out there's a lot of different parts of DoD that do different things successfully to engage companies and help them, to induce them and encourage them to invest capital, private capital. In the investment community, what we tried to do was take a pretty broad look. It turns out that I think a lot of us are familiar with venture capital and the important role venture capital plays in the commercial technology world, and also growing presence in the defense technology world. So that's, of course, an important piece of the landscape. But it turns out that the private equity world is equally important. If you actually add up the dollars and cents of where money is coming from that's flowing into defense companies, private equity is in the same range as venture capital, depending on how you look at it. So that's a really important resource. Strategic investors, so that would be large companies or small companies that are doing mergers and acquisitions of other businesses in the defense sector. That's a really important source of capital. And then commercial banking. So every company, more or less, needs to have a relationship with the commercial bank that can provide it with working capital, a checking account, and a credit card, and maybe term loans that can be used to also help them expand capacity. And then there are other private credit type financial products that are often used, receivables-based financing being one example, that kind of complement that commercial banking market. So there's a whole range of financial institutions and financial services that our defense technology companies access, and all of them are important and all of them play a different role. And so the goal is really to try and find ways to make it easier for companies to access those financial services and put them to work for the Defense Department.
Yeah, so I guess I would love to take a step back and focus a little more on the government R&D spend and some of the vehicles that we already have, and then get into a little bit of where the gaps are and where that might not be enough. So, I've been, as I said in my last conversation where we were focusing on AI driving acquisition, as I'm getting into the space and learning more about funding opportunities, obviously there are things like the SBIRs and SCTRs. There are different procurement vehicles that happen. There are ways that the government is already funding R&D, right? So now when we're thinking about their ability to fund technologies that they're looking for, and now thinking about private capital, where is the government funded R&D falling short? Why isn't that something that is already covering the runway to go from ideation and identification of new technology all the way through being able to procure it and integrate it?
Yeah, that's a great point. So over $100 billion at this point every year of the Defense Department's budget is focused on R&D, RDT&E. It's called research, development, test, and evaluation. And on top of that, the rest of the federal government also spends money on R&D. DoD is the biggest, but you have the National Science Foundation and the NIH. There's many other groups, DOE, that do a substantial amount of investment in science, and that creates beneficial spillovers for the military in many cases. So a lot of money being spent. Much of it is early stage, so it's meant to really be solving for that market failure traditionally, that the very, very far upstream basic type research isn't really fundable by private capital. It's just it's hard to find out which project eventually is going to be producing an ROI, but it still is valuable in the long term for the country. On top of that, you have certain jobs that private investors just tend to do better than government. One example I like to point to is commercialization. In the venture capital industry, just to pick one example, it turns out that many venture capitalists are actually successful entrepreneurs who have successfully created companies, exited them, maybe multiple serial entrepreneurs. They have a really, really good track record and a lot of wisdom and knowledge, oftentimes, to help companies commercialize. So a lot of what they do in the commercial sector when a venture capitalist invests in a company is provide mentorship, resources, a network, great past experience to draw upon to get that company to commercialize. So there's the capital that they're contributing. There's also oftentimes really irreplaceable knowledge that they're bringing in. And so that role, in addition to the capital of really being a commercialization expert, especially in the tech industry, that's something that can be really helpful in the government context too. Because one of the biggest challenges that most government agencies have with science is actually, it's not inventing the interesting new technology and patenting it. It's figuring out how to get it to a market and turn it into a sustainable company. So that's one of the roles that's really important. But of course, there is the capital as well. Federal government dollars are limited by the federal budget. And meanwhile, the private sector, the GDP continues to grow and grow. The Defense Department's budget as a percentage of GDP is the smallest it's been since before World War II right now, as a percent of GDP. Meanwhile, the rest of the economy grows, and those private sector resources, some of them might be available to help flow into the defense sector.
And we're going to come back to the size of the investment as it pertains to GDP a little bit later. So let's talk about, you said failure in the market, right? I like to think of the government R&D spend as being patient capital, right? It really, really is the early stage technology is, hey, what can we do with this? So things like, next generation microcontrollers, next generation quantum computing or first generation quantum computing, things that don't really have a straightforward path to commercialization, which I think is what you're saying when we talk about the market failure, is picking up these really novel and nascent technologies and then being able to identify the either consumer or private applicable use cases that then that technology can be implemented outside of a government environment, right? Is that what you're talking about in terms of the market failure?
Yeah, I think that's right. But I would add that in the defense context, there are some other interesting tools that the government has. So one of them is the DoD is a major buyer of technology. Right? So they represent that market. So DoD can help finance the creation and invention of new technology, testing and evaluation of it. They can also create a market for that product. And so that is one of the major tools DoD has to induce companies to invest their time and talent. DoD also, there's a global military market, right, of our allies and partners. DoD runs foreign military sales as a program, and the rest of the federal government has a role controlling how companies are able to sell into that global market as well. So that market that DoD and allies and partners represent, that's an important additional way that the government can stimulate the creation of new technology. There's other interesting things too, like test ranges, for example. The government controls certain test ranges that the private sector, you just can't get access to otherwise, or they're extremely restricted. So getting access to, a test range for novel rockets, that's something the government has that no one else has. Doesn't matter how much money you have, right? That's a resource the government can bring to the table to help a new technology get commercialized if that's something that's required. And there are a lot of other similar types of systems that the government can bring in. So government has a lot of resources in addition to capital, expertise being another one, that it can bring into a project and foster the development of new technology. So it's really about bringing those puzzle pieces together. And as it turns out, the commercial tech sector in America is extremely healthy. Globally, it's extremely healthy and vibrant. So there's more than ever before in terms of external resources and talent, but the government still has a huge role to play. And so combining those things in a flexible way, where really powerful things can happen.
So when I hear that, I think, great. As a defense contractor, building some new technology, as an R&D lab, doing novel research that has some government grants, in my head, I'm thinking as an optimist, DoD, someone in defense, they're going to pick up this technology and they're going to be my first customer. Great. This is a great logo to have. And I'm going to be fine, right? But that doesn't really tend to be the case for a number of reasons, right? The perception, and we talked about this in the last podcast, the perception is it's really difficult to sell into the government sometimes, even if this is a technology that had been funded and incubated, you have this situation where there's a lot of bureaucracy, or at least the perception of bureaucracy. You have long acquisition timelines. So is that something you still see? Is that a gap that, hey, we still need to fill I think you called it the valley of death, the in between we did the R&D and now we're going through acquisition and there's going to be a lot of proposals. Like where is the gap there that says, yes, defense is going to be a buyer, but that can't be an immediate next step, reliable buyer?
Yeah. That valley of death, that's the term people like to use. And it's a very real problem. And you put your finger on it, which is that federal government, when it procures things, it has a lot of compliance mechanisms. And there's a lot of complexity that goes into purchasing something. Government needs budget, government needs personnel to oversee the purchase and to use the item. There's a lot of ethics rules. So there's a number of hoops that the government has to jump through, and it can create huge delays in the most challenging cases. And of course, in the commercial sector, time delay is extremely critical because the farther away a cash flow is from the perspective of a company and the investors that are backing that company, the less meaningful it is because of the time value of money. And so it's a big challenge to align government timelines with the needs of commercial tech companies that are backed by investors, which have their own metrics to hit. However, that's not to say that it's all bad news. This is a known challenge. There's a lot of success stories too in terms of the government being able to move in an agile way. So it really depends on the office. It depends on the project. But there are many mechanisms that allow the government to purchase things on the pace that commercial companies are a little bit more used to. It's just a matter of widening the use of those tactics. Things like other transactions authority is one of the things people point to most frequently. There are a lot of budget-related acquisition reforms that have happened, and some which may happen in order to speed things up and make things more flexible. So there are ways to do business more quickly, and it's just a matter of increasing the use of those tactics.
So I think later in the conversation, I would love to get to some of the mechanisms and vehicles that exist out there to help accelerate that. One of the things that you mentioned is, private enterprises having a different timeline, different measures of success, and then you mentioned ROI as well. So I like to get into a little bit of the differences. I think in a way we could call them cultural differences between private and public sector, but a lot of times we're measuring ROI differently, right? So what matters to the VC, to the PE, to the investor is going to be a lot different than what's mattering to defense agencies. So what are we talking about with ROI? What are some of the mismatches that we might see?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the commercial sector, what I've observed, and I used to work on raising venture capital for a biotech startup. So I got to talk to a lot of investors in that world, and I won't say they're necessarily representative of every investment group, because as we know, different types of investors have different kinds of timelines they like to meet. They look for different risk profiles. So there's quite a lot of different kinds of money out there, and they judge success differently. And that's important as folks who work in the private sector all know. It's really important to understand the needs of your investor when you work with them. But generally speaking, in the investment sector and companies that are investor backed, they're very focused on the size of the eventual market. They call that generally total addressable market, or TAM. And the larger the market, the more attractive an investment is, because what they ultimately want to be able to do is scale products very quickly. And that's a business model that was extremely attractive really in the last 20 years or so, as the tech industry picked up and the internet enabled very scalable software-based companies to grow to be global, right? That's the story of Google and Facebook and Amazon. So that business model is extremely appealing. And the closer that you can align your company's pitch to a business model like that, the more attractive you are, the more likely you are to get investment dollars. Another important piece of this is time, right? As I said a moment ago, the time value of money, this is a financial phenomenon. There's a formula for it. You can look it up. But what it says is that for investors, they're impatient. They want their money as soon as possible. And if you're not going to deliver sales soon, they'll find somebody who will, and they'll invest their money there. So compressing that timeline to actually making a sale is really critical for attracting investment dollars in a particular thing. Now, to your point, from a government point of view, these metrics are just completely different, right? Government folks, when they're trying to address a real warfighter need, in the case of DoD, they're very concerned with how that object that's being bought, how it integrates with the rest of the weapon systems, how reliable it is, how safe it is, ruggedization. So will this thing really be tough in the environment it needs to be in? Things like waterproofing, temperature, use, storage. So there's an enormous number of things that have to be looked at in different criteria to make something valuable from the point of view of somebody who's trying to buy this for mass usage in a variety of environments. And when the government is trying to put together a procurement plan, an acquisition plan for an item, ultimately that's provided by Congress every year through the Defense Appropriations Bill. And what that means is that there actually has to be a plan for getting that money into an account with a team, usually in some program office, they call them, within DoD, that's going to be in charge of procuring that item and executing that acquisition plan. So all of that has to be determined and planned out in order to, in most instances, actually result in something getting purchased. And so that's not to say that the government doesn't care about time and doesn't care about value, but it is to say that they have their own complex set of purchase planning requirements that they need to oversee.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So I'm seeing, we have government investing in the initial R&D, right? We have the program offices who are looking to acquire technology. At what point, you mentioned, the standards are really high. It has to be tested, ruggedization, things like that, things that the commercial sector might not need or care about. So at what point are we seeing the R&D spend getting you to where your technology will meet the requirements of what the program office, the acquisition officers are looking for versus what they're looking for, right? Is that another barrier to entry where, hey, you've got only so far, and to even close the gap to get considered to have your technology acquired, there's a gap of funding there?
Yeah. And the challenge there is that, as I was sketching out that whole acquisition planning challenge, one of the important details is that there are different, what they call colors of money. So different stages of development require different dollars. So earlier I used a technical term, RDT&E dollars. That's the $100-odd billion that's spent on science and technology and by the Defense Department, research, development, test, and evaluation specifically. And those dollars are appropriated by Congress for that purpose. Meanwhile, there's a separate procurement budget, and it's focused on acquiring specific weapon systems. And so if your product is not all the way matured to exactly where it needs to be ready for procurement, typically what the government will do is create a separate contract using RDT&E dollars to fund you to do that last bit of work. Now, these days, because there really is a pattern with commercial tech companies that have solutions that are partway ready, a lot of offices in DoD are trying to figure out how to give those companies the information they need to spend their own money to do that last bit of prototyping and preparation, ruggedization, whatever the case may be, to get it to the point that it's ready to prototype. Because then you're running one contract to procure, instead of two, one for R&D and one for procurement. So mechanisms like a test and evaluation event or a test and experimentation event where the government can meet with the company, test out their item, give the company feedback. The company can go back and use its own dollars to mature the product. That framework is one that I think is going to get more and more important over time.
And we've talked a lot about the challenges, but I think you have some case studies identified where things have worked really smoothly, right? So not to be all on the challenges side, let's talk about some of the times and examples where, hey, we've proven that this is a capability that we can move at speed for.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a range of different creative ways that DoD has engaged companies specifically on this topic of trying to help them justify investing private capital. One of my favorites concerned a company that is being set up in South Carolina. It's a German company actually that's set up in an American arm called EVAC. They produce magnets using rare earth minerals. Right. This is something during COVID that we realized we didn't have strong enough supply chains as strong as we'd like for the production of electronics items. Well, it turns out magnets using certain rare earths are incredibly important. So what the government was able to do, it turns out, is they learned that there's a lot of commercial use cases for the same magnets that the government was going to use for fighter jets. And so what they were able to do actually is work with General Motors to sign a memorandum of understanding saying we promise to buy X number of these magnets for the Cadillac Lyric, an electric vehicle, as we're rolling them out over the next decade. Combined with a government commitment to buy a certain amount of magnets as well. Together, that constituted a really large demand signal. With that in hand, this German magnets company was able to justify raising $350 million of private capital to build a advanced manufacturing facility in South Carolina. They also leveraged some economic development dollars from the state of South Carolina and a local government. And so they've broken ground, and I believe by the end of the year, they're going to be delivering product. So this is a case where in a traditional path, DoD probably would have set up a contract to fund the company to do that work using government dollars completely, or they would have at least had to sign a procurement contract for the entire line of magnets, and it would have had to be a large enough contract for the company to want to build a facility just for that. So this more flexible arrangement of collaborating with the private sector to set up a demand signal, and then encouraging them to go to the capital markets to raise the capital to create the facility. I should say also that in that case, DoD contributed about, I think, $95 million. So they contributed a large, but about a fifth of the total cost of the facility to catalyze that investment. So that's one example that I think we'll see more of. So that's an example where private equity dollars were really useful. Another one that's really interesting would be a case where the government directly incentivized venture capital to come into a project. So a lot of folks have heard of the Air Force's SBIR program, AFWorks and AF Ventures, the arm that focuses on incentivizing fundraising and other things. So their TACFI and StratFi program, tactical financing, strategic financing, what they do is they will actually match government award dollars, SBIR dollars, to funds that are raised from private investors. Mostly venture capitalists is what they target. And so there are many cases of small businesses and startups that have raised venture capital dollars and then gone and gotten them matched by the federal government and the Air Force. So many of those cases, the great thing about it is venture capitalists are pretty discerning, as well as the Air Force. And so if those two people say that your product is good, it's very likely to be good. Many of those companies that have gone through that program, they've been validated by those very discerning investors, and then they've actually gone on to be quite successful. And so many of those companies at this point, it's been long enough that program has been in place. A lot of those companies are really having a lot of success, both in the commercial market and the government market. It's a pretty strong testament to, number one, the effectiveness in leveraging the capital as a government program, and number two, just the ability to source high quality companies.
It sounds a little bit that these are situations where some of the stars aligned, right? It was really a collaborative effort. We identified a technology that was of strategic importance. We're able to identify the private sector partner to come in with that. We could mutually paint what the future looks like, what the benefit of this looks like. I'm sure there was also benefits with opening up a new factory and local job creation and things like that. What does it take to have a conversation at that scale and level versus what some of maybe the smaller defense industry players or R&D teams are having?
Yeah, that's really tricky. And I think that's probably going to be a barrier or a challenge to scaling the model up because when the government wants to do these kinds of things, there's really quite a lot of resources that can be drawn upon. Right? There's different kinds of investors. There's different pots of money inside of DoD. So the first project I mentioned used something called Title III, which is a pot of money at the OSD level that's quite flexible for some of these use cases. The second example I gave was from the Air Force's small business program, and neither of those programs use the largest source of dollars from DoD, which is procurement, and at least when it comes to providing a market for most commercial companies. And then, as you mentioned, state and local governments have a stake in incentivizing these projects. Now you have a new office in DoD called the Office of Strategic Capital, or it's not so new, a couple of years old, but it's in terms of rolling out the programs, they're still at an early stage. That's another source of dollars that is designed to incentivize specifically private investment into companies. There's tax credits for many of these things. So actually, the Magnets factory example I gave, they actually took advantage of a large tax credit. So combining all of those different things together, that creates a lot of transaction costs, a lot of challenges. And so figuring out, I think a big opportunity here is training and awareness. Some of these programs are well established. Some of them are new, like the Office of Strategic Capital. And so raising awareness for contracting officers and program managers who execute these things, that these opportunities are available, and helping them understand when a project would be a good fit, how to plug in. I think that is going to really expand success stories because there's a lot of resources that are out there and that are available. A lot of these tactics now are getting proven out. And so raising awareness, I think, is gonna help folks think about these things maybe when they wouldn't have been aware of them before.
And raising awareness is really complicated, I'm seeing. As I've been going through this journey and learning about all of the different outlets available, I think I've just scratched the surface, and I've found 25 or 30 different groups that are trying to help facilitate the partnerships between public and private, and it just keeps going on and on. And then, when we get into the CIBRs and all of the different opportunities there, those are also in all disparate places. So then we see groups like Ensign and DIU coming together, and AF Works as well. AF Works ex Air Force folks that are really connected into the ecosystem of the Air Force. I'm sure there's some with other departments, but then you have the organizations that sit on top that say, we're going to try to pull the strings together to help to surface these programs. So, we're getting a little ahead, but when we think about the programs and the toolboxes that we have available to even find these avenues, you mentioned a couple of them, but today, 2025, what is the ecosystem of roll-up, I guess I could say? Who's exposing these programs? Where are the best places for people to go to find the latest information?
Well, I would have to put in a plug for our own organization. You rattled through a lot of the ones I would have pointed to. So I would say there's also industry groups. So NDIA, National Defense Industrial Association, Large Trade Association. We also try and create platforms for government and industry to collaborate, also for industry to be able to have a voice in terms of explaining challenges and opportunities. And my own group within NDIA is the Emerging Technology Institute, we have a large conference coming up in August, 27th through 29th. And that will be the DC Convention Center. So we try and use that as an opportunity to raise awareness and help folks understand the opportunities that are out there. By the way, we just announced our keynote is going to be General Dan Kane, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So that'll be very exciting. And we have many other interesting people coming to talk about these types of things from across the DoD. In government, I think you named a lot of the resources. And what I would say is that that for folks who, I'm sure you have folks in your audience who have been through many of these things, but for folks who haven't, who are just learning about the government as a market, I would say out of all those groups, and some people count hundreds of these connector groups and resource groups in DoD focused on this. I would say the groups that have budget are often some of the most important to look to. So there are connector groups who are essential, but then of course there's groups who are actually buying things and trying things out. And so those are some of the most important groups to track. And new ones get created. Every year there's a new budget, and so there's a new opportunity for new groups and offices to get funded in different ways.
Okay, so you mentioned budget a couple of times. I want to go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. We talked about government R&D spend in relation to GDP and the strategic importance of the government investing in R&D. So let's talk a little bit about that, where it stands, why it's important, what the risk is if we continue to spend at the rate that we're spending. Look, I don't want to make assumptions, so let's talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, my background is studying economics. That's what I got interested in first, before I took a diversion into business and then working for a think tank. And I would not be able to summarize the literature on this, but I can tell you there's a strong literature focused on the importance of funding technology and innovation, because the growth rate of an economy is ultimately determined by the rate of the increase in productivity, which is itself a function of technological growth. And so that's why countries that have vibrant and robust technology ecosystems tend to have much faster economic growth, and then higher living standards for citizens. And of course, military power is really derived from the productive capacity of your country, which is strongly tied to economic, the size of your economy and your growth rate as well. So I think that funding is really essential. And then for all the reasons we've talked about, figuring out how to shepherd new ideas from an early basic research and innovation stage all the way through to commercial use cases, scaling in the commercial sector, but also directing them to government use and more necessary military use. That's not obvious every time how to do that. It's really tricky because the commercial sector is very big and very, very sophisticated. And so bridging that value depth, that's very tricky.
Do you see that as our government shifts its focus on R&D, is there more pressure that's coming on the commercial sector to try to build these new technologies, or pressure for private capital to have to fund this earlier in the incubation stage of the technology? Because what I'm hearing is, if we're going to be strategically investing in things, we have to be spending that money. If we're reducing or pulling back, in order to remain competitive in the global market, somebody's got to be investing in these early stage emerging technologies. Yeah,
absolutely. And then the other piece of it is that a lot of the technologies that the military requires are not necessarily basic research technologies coming out of basic research. A lot of the technologies are IT tools, cybersecurity tools. They're materials that are mass produced in the commercial market. They're chemicals that are used not only by DoD, but they're chemicals that are used by cosmetics companies, pharmaceutical companies. And so basic research is really important, and that's a big focus of the Defense Department. But the translational research, and then what they call spinning in, right? There's the idea of a spin out of a company, but spinning in technologies that have been proven out and scaled in the commercial market to the point that they can be mass produced at quality and scale. Spinning those in for a government or military purpose, that is something that is a growing challenge for DoD, because of the fact that the government market, for the reasons you were saying earlier, can be a challenging one for commercial companies to enter. And so a lot of them avoid it. So figuring out how to take those technologies, some of them which are fairly mature, and then adapt them for government use. That's one of the big challenges and opportunities as well. And that's a big place where private capital is important, because often what you're talking about is scaling an existing assembly line, or onshoring the production of something, or creating a government or military version of something. All of those things require capital. They're not necessarily at the early innovation stage. So maybe a little bit something that a lot of folks might not think about, but they're extremely important for actually making sure that the military has access to appropriate technologies at scale.
And that came up in a previous conversation that we had, where there's also a mental shift that needs to happen in terms of when we spec out, here's the technology that we need, here's the acquisition, here's what we're going to procure. There needs to be a little bit of a loosening up from these are the exact specifications and this technology does not meet that, versus here's the problem that we need to solve. And then you can get companies coming in and say, we solve it this way. It might not look the way that you thought it needed to look, but the solution is there. Let's talk about where this fits in. And you mentioned it, and that's a great point, is let's adapt the commercial technology to the needs, not put the needs first and then try to box everything in and say, no, this doesn't fit because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and one of the ways that this topic gets talked about in government is the idea of commerciality. So where DoD often tends to buy what they call highly complex, exquisite systems, maybe in small numbers. Think F-35 as the poster child, right? Lately, there's been a lot more talk, and since the 90s, really, that there's been recognition that when possible, buying commercial can be very economical for the government. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel and create a totally new item that requires so much development and so much risk. So figuring out how to do that commercial model buying is really important. And I'll add, I think this is one of the tactics that's going to become increasingly important from the perspective of engaging private capital. And the reason is, if you can be buying commercial where previously you would have been buying an exquisite item with for one buyer, DoD, you can buy an item that's being used by the commercial sector, and then you, the DoD, are just one buyer. That creates a lot of resiliency for that company in your supply chain. And it also means that company is a lot more likely to be able to justify investing a lot of capital, scaling up their product, maturing their production, and really just using private capital instead of having to get the government to assist them with doing that job and providing that capital. One of the case studies I looked at, which I really liked, was focused on chemicals production. There was a risk that certain chemicals, including 1,3,5-trichlorobenzene, which is an important chemical for a lot of DoD use cases, was not onshore. This was really appreciated during the pandemic when the supply chain broke down. And what the government did in this case was they found out that cosmetics companies and pharmaceutical companies did use, I don't know if I'm not a chemicals expert, so they looked at a range of chemicals, and that's the first one that came to mind. So they found commercial buyers that also bought large scale amounts of those chemicals, and they were also interested in forming diverse, resilient onshore supply chains. And what they did is, similarly to the magnets example I gave, they created a joint demand signal where the government and the commercial sector were able to align the specifications that they wanted to buy. And what that meant for the production companies was they could justify creating a production line of a chemical, and they would know that they'd have multiple buyers. And what that allowed them to do in that program, overall, they had, I think, a 50-to-1 private capital to government dollar spend ratio. And so the private sector was really able to create this entire complex, resilient supply chain when the government was able to do the upfront work of figuring out exactly what it's buying look like if it could buy commercial and if it could collaborate with commercial buyers to buy those commercial items. So it's a bit of a mindset shift, like you said, but a lot of really, really exciting things can happen in certain circumstances when that work is done.
It sounds like that's kind of the core part that really needs to come together. It's more of an understanding and articulation of, hey, this is what we need, and then turning that into a demand signal and going out to market and really shining a light on these are the demand signals, these are the priorities that we're investing in. And I've seen, again, some of them in different places, right? Here are the top 10 things that, government R&D wants to go to, to invest in, or, here's the demands that we're going to maintain and prioritize, right? And in doing that more effectively, then it goes back to, well, where does the gap lie? Why is private capital unwilling or afraid, or what is the negative perception of investing in that? And one of them is the delays in the demand signals. You don't know how big the market is. So if we can get better on defining and shining the light on the demand signal, then we can begin to attract investors because they know what's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I have to say, I think I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things I looked at was the amount of capital that's invested here. The DoD budget at this point is over $800 billion. It might rise to $1 trillion in fiscal year 26, depending on what happens in Congress, but that's being contemplated. So defense budgets are rising around the world and in the U.S. And the amount of capital, approximately, it's hard to get precise statistics, but approximately invested in the defense industrial base in the U.S. about 100 billion, 75 billion, 100 billion, depending on the year. And that's a combination of public companies. The largest contractors are public, household names like Lockheed Martin, RTX, but also private equity firms and venture capitalists and others. So quite a lot of money is already being invested here. There's a lot of excitement. There are a lot of really talented companies already in the market. A lot of talented companies entering the market, and so there's a lot of success already, and there's probably an opportunity to build on that success and to do even better as these kinds of techniques get more broader use.
But what I'm hearing is it's not so much the amount of money that's being funneled in there; it's the efficient use of that money. Right. And we need to get better at optimizing the identification, all the things that we just said. The more efficient that we can leverage the capital that's already there, then the faster that this flywheel is going to begin to move. I feel a little bit that, increasing the dollars in it's a forcing pressure that gets money out of the avenues that are already there. Right. But it's not facilitating the effectiveness of that sometimes. Yeah, it's tricky. So a little bit of time focusing on different areas, there's improvements that can be made. Yeah. So you have the research out. Let's talk a little bit about the path forward, right? What are some of the things that you see as the shining lights? These are the changes coming into place. What are some of the recommendations that are coming out of your research? Right? How do we leverage the knowledge that yourself has put together and brought to market? So I'll have to put in a plug again that I'm going to be publishing recommendations later this year. So look out for those. So I don't have any final recommendations yet to draw on. However, what I can say is just having taken this initial snapshot view of the landscape, I would say there's a lot of capital already being invested. I think the opportunities are really to increase awareness about all the different tactics, some of them pretty complicated and pretty innovative, some of them very familiar, that the government can use. So we've talked about some of them already, things like non-traditional contracting approaches like other transactions, commercial buying authorities that allow you to do more commercial focused source selection processes, move things a little bit more quickly sometimes.
There are other tactics, like you mentioned, the organizations that focus on building networks, organizations like NSIN, that are able to bring together these communities and help to share that demand signal and help companies and investors understand what the market for their products will be and how to get connected with one another. And then on the demand signal side, there's a fundamental challenge, which is that the ultimate demand signal, which is budget, is given by Congress every year. And nobody knows, not even the most senior people in the Pentagon, what the budget is going to look like in fiscal year 2027, because it hasn't been created yet and no one knows. So no one can tell you what's going to get bought in 27. But the government is getting a lot better, and I think has opportunity to do even more creative things in terms of explaining what that market can look like, accelerating the time to market so that the demand signal is felt more meaningfully by commercial companies. And I mentioned earlier, lately, there's a big focus on commerciality in terms of buying practices in DoD. That is an opportunity for a greater diversity of companies to enter the defense industrial base, and also for those companies, because they serve other markets other than DoD, to apply more of their expertise, their talent, and their capital to the benefit of the government and ultimately the taxpayer. So those are some of the things I'm excited about right now.
Do you see this as also an opportunity for new policy to come into play, to act as a little bit of a forcing lever to say, this is the new way we're going to operate? Have those policies already started coming into play? Is it something that, obviously there's a lot of talk about it. I've been hearing it a lot, even as an outsider, about the friction of, we need to move faster. We need to acquire these things. There's a big drop off between R&D and then the teams taking the R&D and turning it into something that's commercial. So the friction's already there, right? So, what policies are starting to come into play? And then, after that, any last observations, things, and points that you wanted to make?
Yeah, in terms of policy, I would say the biggest one that folks are excited about on this topic would be the creation of the Office of Strategic Capital. So this is really a center in the Office of the Secretary of Defense that's focused on this topic of private capital investment. They're a little bit like almost a development bank in terms of the authorities that they have, and they're rolling out their tools pretty systematically. So they've really just started. They created a tool that supported early stage investing last year. This year they're starting to focus on what they call their equipment financing tool. So you can check out their website to look at their specific tools, but they're building out a couple of interesting mechanisms, and they very well might grow over time as they pilot out their tools and show success. And so that's one of the most exciting areas in terms of proving out new mechanisms, and that's probably an area that a lot of folks in DoD are looking to as they think about how might I do interesting things in the future. So overall, I would say that there are a lot of well-proven tools and tactics throughout the government that have been deployed to engage commercial companies, engage innovative companies, help innovative small businesses mature and grow and get to market, and then stimulate increasing amounts of private capital investment of all kinds to help with that. And so there's a lot of tools that are out there. The past couple of years have seen a lot of policy innovation. So I mentioned Office of Strategic Capital. I mentioned AFWorks and their StratFi TACFi programs. Those are all relatively new and I think very exciting programs that have shown a lot of people there's a lot of interesting things you can do. And I think they very well could get replicated. So I think that combining and raising awareness about all those tools and the new tools, and figuring out how to connect those pieces like we were talking about, because there's so many interesting tools out there, and then combining them often is when you get the most value, but that's also tricky. I think that's probably what I'll be watching over the next months and years.
So it sounds like, on the commercial side of things, on the private sector, the private sector side of things, we really need to take another look at the tools that are available, because it's always shifting. There's an evolution of programs, of offices that are now supporting us in new ways. And if we're not staying up to speed, then we fall into the trap of making assumptions that we're still going to see extended timelines. There's still going to be that valley of death that we talked about, and that it's going to cause friction with raising investor capital. So we have to take a new approach. We have to reevaluate our biases and our expectations because things may have changed already.
Yeah, I think that's possibly true, depending on who you are and what your assumptions are. Some people may need to update, and lately there's been a lot of policy innovation, so things are changing fast. And as I mentioned, defense budgets in the U.S. and globally are growing, so that's, I think, changed the picture for a lot of folks. So yeah, it's a very dynamic market.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for this. I think this has been really helpful in just understanding the ecosystem a little more and giving us some positive outlook of where collaborations can exist. Any final points that you wanted to make?
I'll just say thanks. This was really great. I enjoyed the conversation, AJ.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.